Since 1947, the World Affairs Council has become the preeminent global stage for world leaders and the public to inform, engage, and debate the most important issues of our time. It's your world. Get to know it.
Fat tails, simply spoken, are the 1 in 100 year storms that we increasingly seem to be experiencing roughly every 15 minutes. Right? And, you have normal distributions. You think that these extreme events and outcomes actually are very rare to occur, but in reality they happen much more. Now, I'm not an economist. Why am I standing up here telling you about fat tails affecting the markets? Well, the reason is because increasingly the world's fat tails that are affecting economic outcomes, that are determining the trajectory of our country's economy, that are determining how our 401ks will do, how the stocks we're invested in will do, what languages our kids should learn, are being driven by politics. Over the last 20 years, as an investor, as a decision maker, a policy maker, a corporate leader, a banker, there was one thing you could not afford to get wrong. One thing you had to understand about the way the world worked, and that was globalization. You had to know that increasingly over time, multinational corporations were becoming the most important economic actors in the world, and they were taking advantage of global economies of scale. They were looking to maximize profitability, sometimes long-term, sometimes short-term, labor differentials, global consumer markets, global supply chains. If you missed that, you did badly. Tom Friedman sold 3 million copies of The World is Flat in the United States because he explained that to the average American. By the way, anyone that gets 3 million Americans to read about globalization deserves our thanks. When Obama comes out 3 weeks ago and says that if we don't get the stimulus right, the United States is facing economic catastrophe, his words, not my words. Another way you can read that is that it doesn't matter what the banks do. It doesn't matter the automotive plans that come up, GM and Ford. It doesn't matter how many hundreds of thousands of people are laid off by different companies. If Washington doesn't get the stimulus right, we are in serious trouble. In other words, if you want to understand what's going to happen with the U.S. economy over the course of the next couple of years, you need to watch not Main Street, not Wall Street, you need to watch K Street. I'm really not interested in telling you the relative merits of a person from Bangalore compared to Detroit. That's not really an interesting conversation. It is interesting to note that the average American is much less in favor of free trade and globalization today than they were 20 years ago. That's interesting. It's somewhat less interesting because that's not what's going to determine how policy is made in the United States. That will be determined by corporations who generally are still very pro-free trade, though that may start changing over the next 5 years, particularly vis-a-vis China. We can talk about that. But I'm not interested in making the value judgments. The important point is that we must know that state capitalism is increasing in importance in challenging globalization because it will change the way we think about who the winners and losers are. Right? There's been one superpower in the last 20 years, the United States. Increasingly, very clearly, that's being challenged. The political willingness and the ability of the United States to provide global leadership is much smaller than it used to be. President Obama does not want to deal with foreign policy right now. He is focused on the domestic economic crisis. When he was elected, but before he was inaugurated, we were talking a little bit just now about Israel and about Gaza. And before the talk, John and I, and you remember when Israel invaded Gaza, and Obama was in Hawaii, and he was asked, a little demonstration, he was asked, so what do you think about the Israeli invasion? And he responded, well, we only have one president at a time. I don't want to comment on that. It's very interesting. He did not respond that way when he was asked about the stimulus and bailout for General Motors. Now, I'm not trying to suggest Obama's a hypocrite, certainly no more so than any other politician. That is not my point. It's smart politics. My point is he can't be auto czar, health czar, education czar, and Secretary of State. That is too much.